Hello and welcome to Season 5, Episode 12 of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host, Christina Hagen, coming to you live from Cape Town. We have over 150 episodes recorded and available on YouTube, so if you've missed out on any of our episodes over the past few years, you can always catch up on YouTube. We are on all major social media channels, and you can use the hashtag Conservation Conversations to let us know what you think of the show. We aim to keep these webinars free for all to learn and enjoy. So if you do enjoy the series and can contribute, please visit our website and donate. We have moved away from Quicket as our donation platform, but you can now donate directly through the BirdLife South Africa webpage at the link on the screen, or by scanning the QR code to take you directly there. Otherwise, you can EFT BirdLife South Africa directly and use the reference webinars and your name. We are very grateful to those of you who do continue to support us. We are also running a donation competition with the amazing Ultimate Companion to Birding in Southern Africa as the prize. And we're very grateful to Peter and Irene Ginn for donating these books. If you donate at least 100 Rand, you'll be entered into the draw for one of these books. So each multiple of 100 Rand that you donate gets you another entry. And we will run this until the end of July. So you have more than a month to save up those Rands and donate if you are interested in supporting the webinars and standing a chance to win this amazing book. So tonight we're joined by Dr. Andrew McKechnie, who will be talking to us about the fascinating world of bird physiology, and specifically avian torpor and hibernation. So Andrew McKechnie holds a PhD from the University of Natal, where his postgrad research focused on torpor in Southern African birds. He spent a couple of years as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of New Mexico, and 4 years at Wits before moving to the University of Pretoria in 2008. He currently holds the South African Research Chair in Conservation Physiology at SANBI and is co-hosted by the University of Pretoria. His research program includes multiple aspects of the thermal physiology of birds in the context of climate change. He has a prolific academic record, having trained many students and publishing many scientific papers, and he's also a prolific contributor to the African BirdLife magazine, as well as being a scientific advisor for it. So Andrew, we are very privileged to have you on the show, and we are all looking forward to hearing what you have to share with us. So you are welcome to start sharing your screen and take it away with your talk.
Okay, great, Christina. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, brilliant. Right, evening everyone. Thank you to Christina and the folks at BirdLife for this, for the invitation to once again be part of this wonderful conservation conversation series. Last time I presented one of these webinars 3 years ago, I spoke about how birds handle extreme heat and the magnitude of ways in which they are negatively affected by hot weather. What I'm going to do tonight instead is move across to the lower end of the temperature scale, which certainly seems appropriate given the weather in Pretoria at the moment, and talk about cool birds rather than hot birds. As is often the case with a talk like this, I'm the one giving the presentation, but the work I'm going to be talking about has been very much a team effort. These are just some of the folks I've had the pleasure of working with over the last 2 decades. Ben Smit, now Professor Ben Smit at Rhodes University, who in fact turns 40 years old today, was a postgrad student in my group and was quite instrumental in some of the work I'm going to talk about tonight. Justin Boyles, seen here with the elephant shrew in the Namaqualand, came out from the US for a couple of years to do a postdoc in my group. Rainer Kemp at the bottom over here, seen at his study site for red larks in the Northern Cape, worked on torpor and ground woodpeckers for his honours project. 2 other honours students involved were Rob Ashdown at the bottom here, who would be looking extremely virtuous and hardworking were it not for the black label bottle in the left bottom corner of the picture. And then we have Jess Lund, who worked on pygmy falcons for her honours project and is now a PhD student at Cambridge. And then last but most definitely not least, we have my colleague and good friend, Mark Brigham, who is based in Canada, but as you can see, is equally at home in the Australian outback. What I'm going to talk about tonight is a phenomenon called heterothermy, which refers to the ability of some animals to go into a state of essentially dormancy and reduce their body temperatures and metabolism far below the levels they maintain under normal conditions. The best known category of heterothermy is probably hibernation. At high latitudes, animals like this Arctic ground squirrel spend up to 2/3 of every year underground in a state of dormancy. And during this time, their body temperature decreases from normal levels similar to yours and mine in the upper 30s to, in this case, an incredible -3 degrees Celsius. This -3 degrees in the Arctic ground squirrels is the lowest temperature yet measured in a mammal or bird anywhere, and is physiologically quite remarkable. Hibernation is also well known in other groups of mammals, including bats, hedgehogs, some of the tenrecs from Madagascar, and bears, although it's debatable whether the winter sleep of bears actually qualifies as true hibernation or not. Then a second category of heterothermy is torpor, which also refers to these reductions in body temperature and metabolism and the sort of temporary entrance into a state of dormancy. The difference between torpor and hibernation is simply the time scale involved. Animals hibernate for weeks or months at a time, but torpor typically lasts less than 24 hours, usually at night for diurnal species and by day for nocturnal species. Now, the fact that some small mammals hibernate has been known for several centuries, but the discovery that some birds use torpor is rather more recent. This is a quote from a paper that appeared in an American ornithological journal, The Condor, in 1909. And I'll give you a minute or two to read it. It's also quite interesting to see some of the spelling conventions that prevailed at the time. The hummingbird that Mr. Bowman found very likely looked like this guy on the left over here, fluffed up with its beak pointing skyward. This is the typical posture that hummingbirds assume when they go into torpor. In this case, this bird's gone into torpor on a hummingbird feeder. This guy on the right seems to have misread the textbook and has somehow ended up hanging upside down while in torpor, which is not usually what birds usually do, although it does seem to happen more often than we think in hummingbirds. So we got to the 1940s, and we knew that quite a few birds used torpor, dropping their body temperatures overnight, but there was still no indication at that stage that any birds hibernated and entered this lethargic energy-saving mode for weeks or months at a time. That all changed one day in December 1946, when this gentleman, Edmund Jaeger, wearing the black jacket, was a botanist at UCLA. And he was hiking one day in the Chuckwilla Mountains of Southern California. And what he and his colleagues are examining in this photo is a hollow in the rock, which contains a remarkably common poorwill, a North American species of nightjar. When Jaeger removed the poorwill from the rock crevice, he realized it was in the same lethargic and non-responsive state as torpid hummingbirds. But his subsequent observations revealed that this bird remained in this state for weeks at a time. And this species remains the only known bird capable of hibernation. One of my American colleagues has an absolutely incredible picture of a hibernating poorwill in the Sonoran Desert, with fresh coyote tracks passing within a meter of it, and presumably the bird's exquisite camouflage and lack of scent while in hibernation ensure that they remain undetected by predators. Now, most of this talk is going to explore which birds use torpor in hibernation and the circumstances under which they do so. But before we start, it's worth considering for a moment why these responses evolved in the first place. Why did mammals and birds develop this capacity to turn down their body temperature and go into the state of unresponsiveness? So the answer involves the fact that being warm-blooded, or more correctly known as endothermic, requires a lot of energy. Endothermy confers many benefits. It allowed early mammals to become nocturnal. It allows animals to be active in cold conditions. It provides the basis for rapid internal development of young, reducing development periods and the associated predation risks. At a biochemical level, it provides a constant optimized milieu for enzymes and other molecules to operate. But these benefits of being endothermic, or warm-blooded if you want, come at a substantial cost. And to illustrate that, if you compare the daily energy requirements of a 7-gram white-bellied sunbird to those of a 7-gram Orchrabes flat lizard, what you'll find is that the sunbird needs around 35 times more energy per day. It needs to find 35 times more food than the ectotherm. And these very high energy demands are the price that birds and mammals pay for endothermy, for this capacity to keep warm in the cold using internal heat production. The cost of being an endotherm becomes even more of a problem if you are feeding on a food type whose availability decreases when it's cold. To illustrate this issue, I want to show you some data that Rob Ashdown collected nearly 20 years ago in Hishwani Mountain Reserve outside Rustenburg, where we were studying freckled nightjars. In 2006, Rob did an honors project with me on one specific aspect of freckled nightjar ecology, and that was how the availability of their aerial insect prey varies through the year and how it relates to temperature. We all know that insect activity levels are lower on cold nights compared to warm nights, but what Rob's project was intended to do was to quantify this specifically for the freckled nightjars at Hishwani. So he built essentially a giant insect net that we mounted on a vehicle and then drove at constant speed around the reserve at night at different times of the year. His data looked like this. So this is the number of insects per 1,000 cubic meters of air, so essentially per kilometer driven, as a function of air temperature on this axis over here. And as we expected, as it got colder, the availability of insects declined rapidly. At 20 degrees, there were around 20 to 50 insects per kilometer of driving, whereas at any temperatures below 14 degrees, there were essentially no insects. This creates a challenge for the nightjars because the energy needed to keep warm increases as it gets colder. So essentially, they face a mismatch between energy supply and energy demand, simply because as their energy demands go up as it gets colder, the food available in the environment and the food's energy supply does the exact opposite, it declines. The same is true for other food types, including to some extent anyway, including things like nectar, which of course is the reason that hummingbirds feature so prominently in this talk. So the point really is that the challenges or the costs of being an endotherm and the energy requirements become even more difficult to meet when it's cold and you're feeding on a food type whose availability is temperature dependent. So there was a bit of background as to why mammals and birds evolved this capacity to go into torpor and hibernation in the first place. Let's look quickly at exactly what is involved. So this figure, I apologize, is quite a noisy one, simply represents the body temperature of 3 different species over a 24-hour cycle. So from midnight to midnight, there is daytime, there is nighttime in the black box, and daytime again. And what I've plotted here is the body temperature pattern in the absence of torpor, so under normal conditions when the animal's remaining nice and warm. I've plotted data for 3 species. The green line is for an elephant shrew, the light blue line for a hummingbird, and the red line for humans. What happens during torpor or hibernation, in this case torpor, is that body temperature during the rest phase is reduced right down below these normal levels to, sometimes temperatures below 10 degrees. So this is the reduction in body temperature that's accompanied by this massive decrease in the rate of metabolism. And this is what saves the animal energy overnight. The next morning, it re-warms back up to normal body temperature and resumes activity. So that was the first part of the talk, where we looked at some early accounts of heterothermy and looked at some background into the ecological significance of these responses. What I'm going to do now is move on to the second part of the talk and take you on a whistle-stop tour of some of the birds that use torpor and the various ways in which they do so. Our first stop is Namaqualand. And I'm going to be talking about freckled nightjars, which we worked on a year or two after the birds in Geshwani. At this site, about 30 kilometers south of Springbok in the Northern Cape, Ben Smith and Justin Boyles attached transmitters to 6 nightjars. The transmitters they use differ from standard wildlife tracking transmitters because, in addition to allowing them to locate the birds, the transmitters are temperature sensitive. And so by timing the intervals between beeps on a radio receiver, Ben and Justin could record the skin temperature of the nightjars from a distance without disturbing them. Now, these 2 graphs, which at first glance look pretty noisy, but are actually quite straightforward, show skin temperature on this axis over a 4-week period in winter 2009 and over another 4-week period in winter 2010. So these data up here are skin temperatures from individual nightjars, and you can see how the nightjars used torpor. They went down to about 25 degrees at certain parts of the month. This bar graph at the bottom is really interesting. So this is lunar phase, or percentage lunar illumination. So if there's full moon, there's new moon when it's very dark. And there's this very tight correlation that jumps out immediately, where the birds are tending to use deeper torpor, the darker it is. And what you're essentially seeing here is the fact that nightjars, although their eyes are very well adapted to low light conditions, still need some light in order to see their insect prey. And around new moon, it is simply too dark for them to forage. And they respond to that by dropping their body temperature and going into torpor to save energy. Just as a matter of interest, the few occasions where we did see drops in body temperature around full moon, there are a couple of examples here, actually coincided with cloudy nights. It was really quite remarkable. On these nights, when the moon was visible, the nightjars were warm and foraging. As soon as the moon went behind clouds for more than half an hour or so, they would drop into torpor. So a really interesting data set. At the very end of the study, one of the birds surprised us and dropped his body temperature way below anything else we'd seen so far, all the way down to around 10 degrees Celsius. And this nightjar over here was actually this individual. When Justin took this photo, its skin temperature was just 12 degrees, and it was in that same completely non-responsive state as the common poorwill you saw a few slides ago. So really nice data on a nightjar here in Southern Africa. It turns out that nightjars and their allies are, in fact, one of the most heterothermic groups of birds we know of, rivaled only by the hummingbirds. If you look at nightjars globally, you find this range of minimum body temperatures going from around 27 degrees in the tawny frogmouth from Australia. This is a big bird, it's 500 grams, all the way down to around 4 degrees in hibernating common poorwills. So a wide range of abilities in these nightjars in terms of how far they can drop their body temperature and for how long they can do so. Staying on the nocturnal bird theme, in 2007, Ben Smith did part of his master's anyway, investigating whether small owls in Southern Africa use torpor. Working at Moloko Nature Reserve in the Northwest Province, Ben attached tiny temperature-sensitive transmitters to pearl spotted owlets and African scaup owls. He used the same backpack-mounted transmitters we subsequently used for the nightjar. You can see the transmitter over there. And the way these work is that they held in contact with the bird's skin between its shoulder blades by means of a tiny harness constructed from Teflon ribbon. This is the underside of the harness you can see on the pearly over here. So we fit these harnesses very carefully. We let the birds go and then collect data remotely using a radio receiver. Ben spent a couple of weeks tracking the owls in the cold Kalahari winter. His data for the pearlies looked like this. So these guys remained warm throughout the study. Skin temperature was never really much below 38 degrees, and so a complete lack of torpor. The scaup owls were slightly more interesting. They often showed small drops in body temperature to around 31, maybe just slightly lower, early in the morning after the activity period had ended. They then warmed up during the course of the day, back up into the higher 30s. So the take-home message from this little story is that different species, even if they're quite closely related, often vary in terms of whether they use torpor or not. And the pearl-spotted owlets are just one of several species that appear to not to use heterothermy at all. Then in 2016, Rainer Kemp investigated a species that we considered likely to use deep torpor, the ground woodpecker. By this stage, I mean, I'd been studying torpor for 20 years. I liked to think I had a fairly good handle on the reasons why some species would use torpor and others wouldn't. And there were a couple of reasons why I steered Rainer towards the ground woodpeckers. One is their generally cold habitat. In this case, we worked on ground woodpeckers around Clarence in the Eastern Free State. Really, really awful place to spend a couple of months doing field work. But another concerns the fact that the ground woodpeckers roost in burrows on cliff faces, which are very inaccessible places, and in fact took quite a bit of effort to get to while we were doing the research. The thing about this is that if you are roosting in a relatively inaccessible site to predators, it's a safer environment for you to go into torpor and go into that non-responsive state. And so this was a main reason why we identified the ground woodpeckers as a possible candidate for torpor. We didn't use transmitters in this study, simply because it would have been impossible to pick up the signals while the woodpeckers were in their burrows. And so what we did instead was we roped in a local vet in Bethlehem who surgically implanted tiny temperature loggers the size of a small watch battery, which he then removed at the end of the study before we released the woodpeckers back at their capture sites. So when the day came for the transmitters to be removed, the sense of anticipation was acute, and there was an air of great excitement. We really thought that this was a species that was going to amaze us and use really deep torpor at night. To try and convey our sense of anticipation before I show you the data, you'll notice that I've scaled this body temperature axis all the way down to 5 degrees because this is the kind of torpor we were hoping for in the ground woodpeckers. And this is what the data looked like. Brace yourself. The woodpeckers surprised us all right, but certainly not in the way we were expecting. None of the individuals in the study population showed any indication whatsoever of using torpor at night. Instead, they showed this frankly quite boring pattern of normothermy with body temperature never once dropping below 36 degrees. So this theme of birds not using torpor, even when they seem at face value to be likely candidates to do so, is a repeating one. And I'll say a bit more about possible reasons for that towards the end of the talk. But never fear, I do have one last example of torpor to share with you, and this is a truly spectacular one. If we go back about 10 years, the lowest body temperature that had been recorded in a bird was 4.3 degrees in a hibernating common poorwill. And this value was just slightly below the minimum body temperature that had been measured in a hummingbird, which was 5 degrees Celsius in a species called the Andean hill star, which roosts in caves at high altitudes in the Andes Mountains. and was the subject of a PhD by an American biologist called Lynn Carpenter back in the 1970s. And she measured a temperature of 5 degrees in one of these birds roosting on the wall of a cave. In March 2015, I was invited along on a trip to the Peruvian Andes to join colleagues from the University of New Mexico who were heading up there to work on hummingbirds. Unfortunately, my lecturing commitments at Tukey's at the time did not permit me to go over to South America on that particular occasion. And so I had to stay in my office and essentially turn a bright shade of green at the thought of my colleagues studying hummers at 4,000 meters above sea level in the Andes at the site you can see on the slide. It's a study site that required hauling gear on donkeys to get to, and has a stunning diversity of flowering plants, which means a stunning diversity of hummingbirds. So a really remarkable place for studying these little birds while I turned green in my office back in South Africa. Over the next couple of weeks, my colleague Blair Wolf was able to measure overnight body temperature in 28 hummingbirds belonging to these 5 species. They range in body mass from 5 grams, 6, 7, 8 grams over here, all the way through to this monster, the giant hummingbird, which weighs in at 24 grams. It's more than double the size of the next biggest hummingbird. Just as an aside, a study was published a couple of weeks ago suggesting that there might actually be 2 species of giant hummingbirds. So those of you interested in hummingbird taxonomy or just your South American lists, watch this space, because I think the species might be split in the not too distant future. Anyway, back to Torpor. So what I've done here is plot traces from body temperature patterns for just 2 species, the sparkling violet here on the left over here and the black metal tail on the right. Now, what I've done here is I've just taken one long torpor trace per species and shown it in blue, and one short torpor trace and shown it in pink. So these were traces from different individuals that Blair recorded over that 3-week period. These dashed lines are just corresponding air temperature. This data set's quite typical of hummingbird torpor. One of the really interesting things about these guys is how rapidly they can rewarm at the end of a torpor bout. These guys were rewarming during Blair's work at 1.5 degrees per minute. So literally going from body temperatures around 5 to body temperatures around 40 in half an hour, so some really quite remarkable physiology in these birds. Now, the highlight of this was the minimum body temperature shown by this black metal tail in the blue trace. And the minimum body temperature was 3.26 degrees Celsius, which is the lowest body temperature yet reported in a bird. And I'm sure you can imagine how excited I was when I first saw these data. So, you know, this is a really nice example of extreme avian physiology. The fact that these hummers on a nightly basis go into this deep lethargic state where their body temperature is only a few degrees above freezing. It's really quite exciting stuff. I want to return very briefly to the topic of hibernation. It's now more than 80 years since Edmund Yeager discovered the poorwill hibernating in a rock crevice in Southern California. Despite active research into this field ever since then, no one has yet found a second avian hibernator. I personally struggle to believe that the common poorwill is the only bird capable of doing this. It seems very unlikely that just one of the 10,000 bird species on the planet have evolved this capacity to hibernate. And I mention this now because I think that one of the environments in which we have a really good chance of finding a second avian hibernator is in these high altitude cave roosting hummingbirds in the Andes. An Argentinian colleague was telling me many years ago at a conference how he regularly observes hummingbirds going into caves and not emerging for several days during inclement weather, which really supports the possibility that these guys are in fact hibernating and going into this state for several days at a time. Needless to say, I am making plans to get over to the Andes with a thermal imaging camera to go and check this out for myself. Okay, so I want to start wrapping this talk up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to step back from studies of individual species, which we've looked at for the last couple of minutes, And instead, I'm going to zoom out to overall patterns of heterothermy in birds, overall patterns across the diversity of birds on the planet. So this is an avian family tree, older groups at the top. We've got the ducks and the geese up here, the galliforms, going all the way through to the passerines, songbirds, which are the most recently diverged order. And what I've done here is I've indicated the extent to which these different species can reduce their body temperature using this color scale. So where you see red branches on this family tree, that indicates that the birds are dropping their body temperature by a very small amount, sometimes 2 or 3 degrees, not nearly enough to even classify as torpor. And the darker blue colors are species where, like the hummingbirds and the nightjars, you have these huge reductions in body temperature, and body temperatures going down all the way to around 0 to 5 degrees Celsius. Now, one of the patterns that jumps out here is that deep torpor tends to occur in phylogenetically older groups, in the Capri mulgirds and in the hummingbirds, and in the hummingbirds' close relatives, the swifts. There are also a couple of, before I get to that, I should mention that what I've done here is illustrated groups that go below 25 degrees. That's kind of an arbitrary cutoff that I've used for the purposes of this figure. There are a couple of non-passerine groups that drop below 25, not quite as deep as these guys over here. They include a species of fruit dove, which I'm going to be talking about shortly, the toadies, little relatives of the kingfishers that live in Central America and South America, and then the mousebirds here in Southern Africa. I actually worked on torpor and mousebirds for my PhD at the University of Natal. But then things go pretty quiet, and the only sign of perhaps torpor that we see in the songbirds are 2 species of sunbirds that drop their body temperature just below 25. They only go down to 23, 24 degrees, but these are literally the only passerines that have been reported as showing body temperatures below 25. So relative to these older groups, the songbirds have this very modest capacity to lower their body temperature. There's no obvious reason why this should be the case, especially when you consider that almost every group of small mammals, irrespective of who they're related to, uses either deep torpor or hibernation. This puzzling absence of torpor in songbirds, which represent more than half the birds on the planet, is something that my students and I have given a fair amount of thought over the years. We've come up with a couple of possibilities that sound pretty good to us, but we don't yet have a definitive answer for you, unfortunately. We do think, however, that one of the reasons why so many birds who would seem to benefit from deep torpor don't use it has to do with predation risk. Birds, because they usually roost above ground, may, in general, be more vulnerable to predators, nocturnal predators, compared to small mammals that retreat into burrows and rock crevices, and in the case of bats, inaccessible sites on human buildings. If you're an animal that faces a meaningful risk of encountering a predator at night, the last thing you want to do is become unresponsive and go into this dormant state and lose the ability to react quickly to what's happening around you. This notion that predation risk is important does have some very circumstantial support. 20 years or so ago, a German colleague of mine made the rather unexpected discovery that this fruit dove, the cloven-feathered dove, uses torpor. It goes all the way down to about 22 degrees. A decade or so later, one of my students, Matthew Noakes, who's now a lecturer at Wits University, did an honors project on African green pigeons and found no indication of torpor whatsoever. And these doves make an interesting comparison in the context of predation, because the cloven-feathered dove occurs on the island of New Caledonia in the Pacific, which, until the arrival of humans and the animals they brought with them, had no native nocturnal predators that would pose a risk to a torpid bird. African green pigeons, on the other hand, are potentially threatened by several predators, like the genet you saw on the last slide. So perhaps predation risk is the primary reason why this species does use torpor and this species does not. Okay, to finish things up, let's spend the last 2 slides briefly talking about how birds that use torpor and hibernation are likely to be affected by climate change. On the face of it, you would expect that warming temperatures would reduce the need to use torpor in the first place, and this may well hold true for some species. But in the case of species like the hummingbirds, for whom regular deep torpor on a nightly basis is a fundamental part of their ecology and natural history, the situation is slightly less intuitive. The hummingbird study I mentioned a few slides back garnered a fair amount of attention from the media when we published it. And when I was reading some of the articles based on our paper, one of the phrases that really jumped out at me was this one: hummingbirds in the Andes Mountains don't fight the cold, they embrace it. Because this really captures the essence of the role of torpor in these hummingbirds. It is not some kind of emergency response that they only use when there's a decline in food availability, but it's rather a fundamental part of their day-to-day existence. And to the point that their nighttime body temperatures seem to have evolved to match the temperatures they experience in the caves in which they roost. Now, when in deep torpor, both increases or decreases in the temperature of an animal's surroundings can cause its metabolic rate to go up. We don't need to go into the details. This blue line over here shows the relationship between metabolic rate and air temperature. And all you need to take away from this is that metabolic rate is minimized at some air temperature, and as air temperature goes down, metabolic rate increases, but as temperature goes up, metabolic rate also increases. And this is the set point temperature where there seems to be a correlation between the temperature at which birds use torpor and the minimum body temperatures they maintain during that state. And the real problem is that warming temperatures can increase the amount of energy these birds are using while in torpor. This issue has been investigated in several mammals, and in the case of species like little brown bats in North America, climate change is driving shifts in the winter distributions of these hibernating bats purely because of this effect of increasing temperature on how much energy they save during hibernation. So while not nearly as obvious an impact of global warming on birds as some of the effects we see in midsummer and hot deserts, for example, there's nevertheless this insidious negative effects of warming temperatures on birds that do go into deep torpor on a regular basis. Okay, that's pretty much it from me for tonight. These are the take-home messages I'd like to leave you with. We've seen how torpor is widespread in birds, although there are probably as many species that don't use it as there are that do. There's the intriguing question of hibernation in birds and whether there are other avian hibernators out there waiting to be discovered. And I hope that this talk has provided you with a new perspective on what's a very little known but incredibly interesting aspect of bird biology. So with that, I will thank all of these organizations for supporting or making this work possible over the last 2 decades, and I will thank all of you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Andrew. That was an amazing and fascinating talk. I definitely learned quite a few things, and I'm sure our audience did as well. So thank you very much for sharing your work and that of all your students and collaborators. We have some questions coming in the Q&A box. So if anyone else has any questions, do please put them in the Q&A box rather than the chat feed, as it's hard to keep track of the chat feed. But before we get onto the questions, I just want to remind everyone that we will be back in 2 weeks' time. And the webinar will be on the Coordinated Avifaunal Road Counts, or CAR counts. And this is a very important citizen science project. So if anyone's interested in citizen science and birding for a cause, then please do join in and join us and learn more about that. So firstly, I think this was asked by a couple of people. From Penny Abbott. How do the birds warm themselves up so quickly? Because you mentioned they go, within half an hour, they're back to normal temperatures. How do they do that?
They do it through a combination of shivering and then also a phenomenon called non-shivering thermogenesis, which is basically just a fancy way of saying that they can produce heat even without shivering. We're all familiar with the idea of shivering, this idea that if you rapidly contract and relax muscles, you produce heat as a byproduct of that. So hummingbirds do shiver. But then they've also got molecular machinery that allows them to produce a lot of heat without actually shivering. And, I don't think we want to go too deep into the biochemistry of it tonight, but essentially what happens is the pathway in cells that generate ATP is decoupled. And so instead of ATP being synthesized, all that's produced is large amounts of heat. But it's truly it's incredible. I mean, when these birds are warming up from torpor, their metabolic rates can be as high as when they are hovering in front of a flower. So this little bird sitting completely still is pumping out the same amount of heat as when it's hovering in front of a flower with its heart beating at 1200 beats per minute. So it's a short answer combination of shivering and then other molecular mechanisms that have evolved to produce large amounts of heat in very short periods.
Okay, so that kind of answers this question from Sean, I think. Do we know which metabolic mechanisms allow heterothermia to occur? And I think you've kind of touched on that, but is there anything else you want to add?
Not really. I mean, look, the basic idea here is, animals essentially have this internal heater. So this capacity of mammals and birds to produce heat internally, can be thought of as an internal heater. And under normal conditions, they adjust that heater setting to balance how much heat they're losing to the environment. When they go into torpor, they essentially switch off that heater altogether. And that's what causes their body temperature to drop down. There's some really fascinating research happening on hibernating mammals. I'm going to a conference in a few weeks' time called the International Hibernation Symposium, which might sound like a conference where everyone just gets together in a room and falls asleep. But it's actually more interesting than that. And there's often a lot of sort of biomedical researchers there. I'll give you an example. If you want to find a cure for osteoporosis in patients who are bedridden for longer periods of time, well, maybe you can start looking at animals that spend months inactive and yet don't lose bone mass. And so hibernating bears have become really useful for medical research into how to prevent bone mass loss. There's all kinds of mechanisms involved. I don't want this to turn into a biochemical lecture, so honestly.
No, that's really interesting. So John Horrocks asks, are you aware of any change in mass of the bird before and after the recovery from torpor?
Yes, they're burning a fair amount of fat to warm back up. So when they're rewarming, they're metabolizing fat reserves. So they are certainly going to lose a little bit of mass overnight. But primarily when they rewarm. So if you measure, if you weigh a bird continuously while it's in torpor, you'll see very small, sometimes indetectable changes in body mass until they start rewarming. And then all of a sudden, because they're metabolizing that fat, they tend to lose mass much more rapidly. Look, typically a bird that stays warm overnight, just thinking of some of the species in the Kalahari we've looked at, they typically lose maybe 5-6% overnight. So those are birds that are not using torpor. In birds that use torpor, that might drop down to 1%, less than 1%. And in fact, in this hummingbird study, we had body mass data, and so we could show that there was a relationship between how far into torpor these birds went and how much weight they lost overnight.
Okay. There's a question now from Rob Simmons asking, would you not expect some sort of torpor in Arctic or Antarctic birds? Cold temperatures and a lack of predators would favor it, surely.
Interesting question, Rob. I think the reason that you don't see torpor in Arctic birds is because the species that are there are primarily songbirds, or primarily quite large-bodied. I'm thinking things like grouse and ptarmigan. You also find that birds at those high latitudes often cache food, and often use warm microsites. So they go into tunnels in the snow, etc., etc. So yeah, you would certainly, on the face of it, expect these responses to be common in birds in very cold environments, but it tends not to be the case. It's really interesting, if you go back, if you look at mammals and birds in general, in the 1980s, the paradigm was that this was some kind of adaptation to these cold, high latitude environments. But what we now know is that these responses are as common in tropical environments. In fact, they probably evolved in tropical environments. And so it's not necessarily something that's associated with very cold temperatures in birds or necessarily in mammals.
Okay. Brian de Villiers asks if there's any evidence that the malachite sunbird goes into torpor.
Yeah, they certainly go down to about, I think, 26, 27 degrees. There was a very nice study on them about 20 years ago by Mark Brown and Colleen Downs, and they had their birds going down, I think it was to about 27 degrees.
Wow, okay. Sorry, just looking for the next one. Penny Abbott asks, I guess going back to your nightjar study with the insects and the moonlight, is insect activity less on moonless nights, or is it just that the nightjars don't see as well?
I don't get the impression that it is lower on dark nights. My impression is that it's equivalent to on moonlit nights. We certainly didn't find any correlation during Rob's study. And I think what's essentially happening on those dark nights is that you have increased foraging by bats. So bats and nightjars are really interesting because one's a visual hunter, the others obviously echolocate. And I think there might almost be a bit of niche partitioning going on there, where nightjars are out feeding when it's light, whereas bats tend to forage more on dark nights because they don't need any light whatsoever to locate their prey. I'm speculating a bit, but I think it's a really interesting question.
So Eleanor Richardson, just on the topic of bats, has put a comment in saying bat species which are vulnerable to predation during the day, for example, fruit bats, show little to no torpor. And banana bats are interesting in that they seem to be able to fly at relatively cool body temperatures. So that's just a comment, but I don't know if you have any sort of thoughts on that.
Yeah, look, the big pteropodid bats, so the fruit bats that we have and the flying foxes, they've got in Australia, seem not to have much of a capacity for torpor. I think it's partly because of their large body size. So one of the issues is that the bigger an animal is, the less efficient torpor becomes, because that cost of warming back up to a normal body temperature for a given change in temperature, that cost increases the bigger you are, but it increases disproportionately.
Right.
So torpor is just not as efficient, and large animals can't achieve the same energy savings as small animals. And I think that's why you don't see pronounced torpor in the so-called macrobats. She's absolutely right about some animals being active at lower body temperatures than we thought. I know of studies of small marsupials in Australia that move from their crevices to sunlit spots on the rocks when their body temperature is still 15 degrees. The whole question of behavior during those cold temperatures is a really interesting one. But certainly once you get down to the sort of below 10 range, I don't think there's any chance of coordinated movement at those body temperatures.
Now a question from Nicolette asking, do you know of any studies on swifts and or swallows in South Africa on torpor? She's seen swallows become very still and seemingly unconscious in poor weather conditions. such as several days of cold and rain, is this likely torpor, or can they suffer hypothermia in bad conditions?
Okay, so on the swifts, there are studies on European species. I've been eyeing the swift nests in the courtyard of the zoology building on the University of Pretoria campus for many years, but I've just haven't got around to getting a student to work on them. The swallows are an interesting question, and we actually, I actually had a master's student in the last couple of years who looked at both sunbirds and South African cliff swallows down in the Harrismith area, and found no indication of torpor in the swallows. I mean, they certainly do go into the sort of hypothermic state. Whether it's something that they can recover from under natural conditions, I'm not sure. But the swallows are pretty interesting because of the ecological similarities to the swifts, and are certainly a group that deserve further study.
Okay, well, hopefully you or some students can get onto that at some point. Now, a question taking us back a bit to the biochemistry. Shashi Kassan asks, is there any literature on the hypothalamus hormones and melatonin studies in torpor?
Look, the hypothalamus is certainly involved in these heterothermic responses. There's a really interesting thing in hibernating animals where there's a structure in the hypothalamus that's essentially the body's clock. It's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, if I remember correctly. And that seems to be completely temperature compensated. So what I mean by that is that most of the processes in the brain slow down dramatically when a mammal goes into hibernation. But that internal clock, if you want, keeps ticking away at the same rate. The rate of that clock ticking does not change with temperature. So the hypothalamus is certainly involved in the process, yes.
Okay, thanks for that. And then Anthony Catella asks, why does the metabolic rate increase when the air temperature decreases below 15 degrees? So I guess that's in reference to that graph you showed.
Yeah, because when air temperature is higher than the body temperature the bird regulates during torpor, the bird essentially becomes an ectotherm, and its body temperature just varies with environmental temperature in the same way that a lizard's would or a frog's would. And in that ectothermic state, metabolic rate depends on temperature, like most biochemical reactions, many physical reactions as well. And so as it gets warmer, as the environment gets warmer, the animal's metabolic rate increases with it. It doesn't increase linearly, it's kind of an exponential relationship. But essentially that animal's now in an ectothermic state. And so its metabolic rate increases as body temperature increases.
Okay, thanks for that. Another question from Rob Simmons. Is there any correlation between plumage color and heterothermy, or in desert animals in hot environments?
Not any kind of link between plumage coloration and heterothermy. But Rob, I can tell you an interesting story about plumage coloration in very hot environments. So the relationship between feather color and solar heat load, you think of a crow nesting on the top of a telephone pole in the middle of the Karoo. That relationship is quite counterintuitive. And what happens in very hot environments, particularly where they're quite windy, is that dark plumage tends to be cooler than light plumage. And the reason for that's really interesting, because dark plumage has got a much higher density of pigment molecules. Photons tend to be intercepted right at the outer surface and get dissipated from there when it's windy. Whereas in light plumage, yes, your visible wavelengths get reflected, but the infrared photons make it much further into the plumage before they're intercepted by pigment molecules. And so the heat's being generated much closer to the skin. So there's a very counterintuitive relationship between plumage coloration and heat load in hot conditions. But in terms of a link with heterothermy, not that I'm aware of.
Okay, Yeah, that is interesting and counterintuitive about the black birds in these hot environments. Going back to Torpor, Silvio and Christu actually asked quite similar questions about the heart rate and respiratory rate during torpor. How much do they decrease, and to what rate can they go down to?
So hummingbirds, their resting heart rate when they're perched on a branch and they warm, they're normothermic, typically around 400 beats per minute. During deep torpor, that can go down to about 30 beats per minute. So that little heart is beating literally once every 2 seconds. When they are hovering in front of a flower, that heart rate can be as high as 1,200 beats per minute. So it's 20 heartbeats per second.
Wow.
There's a much greater scope for changing heart rate compared to humans.
Yeah, that is quite incredible. Michelle has a couple of questions. So firstly, how would you recognize or account for mortality events whilst studying the tagged nightjars, since a bird that died would surely show a reduction in skin temperature and stop moving in the same way that a bird undergoing torpor would? And also, Michelle was also wondering if you've seen the paper by Romano et al. Suggesting that superb fairy wrens undergo torpor. Yeah.
So on that fairy wren study, the definition of torpor is surprisingly still not completely cut and dried. And I've been engaged in an academic debate with some colleagues for the last better part of 25 years now, where my argument is that an animal needs to be in that lethargic state to be considered in torpor, whereas a lot of colleagues, including the authors of the Romano et al. Fairy wren paper, call any decrease in body temperature below normothermy torpor. So I don't agree that is the same state of torpor as a hummingbird goes into, but the term is certainly used in the literature sometimes to describe even fairly shallow states of heterothermy, so small reductions in body temperature. The question about the nightjars and mortality events, we actually had an interesting case with the Freckled nightjar study at Geshwani outside Rustenburg. I didn't talk about that study, but we looked at torpor there as well. And one day, one of our birds went really cold and remained really cold. And so we went out to go and see what was going on. And we eventually located the transmitter. The signal was coming from the middle of a grassy plain, which was very weird, given that Freckled nightjars roost on rocks. And so we went and found this transmitter, and we found it in the middle of a jackal dropping. So that particular bird, which was the only mortality we had been eaten by a jackal.
Oh wow!
It's quite interesting. We've got some evidence that jackal predation on nightjars is more common than people think. When Justin Boyles was in Namaqualand, he was sitting out at the study site one night trying to call up a nightjar into a mist net so we could catch it and put a transmitter on. And he was sitting there in the dark with a speaker playing the Freckled nightjar call at intervals. And he was sitting there, his headlamp was off, and then he turned it on, and there was a jackal about 3 meters away from the speaker stalking it. So I think vocalizing nightjars on the ground are probably more vulnerable to predators than we realize.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. I guess that's the price you pay for trying to find a mate.
There you go.
Another question from Rob Simmons. Any evidence that pygmy falcons go into torpor on cold Kalahari nights?
Rob, another great question. So the reason I'm laughing, back in the 1980s, a guy called Colin Sapsford, who you might have known actually, worked on pygmy falcons up at Nosib in the Kalahari Transfrontier Park. And he did have his falcons dropping their body temperature into the upper 20s. So probably pretty close to what could be considered torpor. Jess Lund's project in 2018, which we did in Tswalu, was intended to follow up on the Sapsford study. And we did not find any torpor whatsoever in Jess's birds at Tswalu. They all remained completely normothermic through the entire study period. We were possibly unlucky because that study happened after a fairly wet summer. And so food availability might have been higher than it was during Colin's study up in Nosib. So the pygmy falcons, yes, they do seem to have the capacity to drop body temperatures, probably not below 25 degrees, but it doesn't seem to be a regular part of their thermoregulation.
Okay. Then David Moran says, you mentioned a mammal with a temperature below 0, and he asked whether it was frozen or how does it avoid being frozen?
So what they do is they basically produce antifreeze proteins in their blood. So they produce molecules in the blood that prevent it from freezing. I mean, whole blood is not going to freeze at exactly 0. It's going to freeze at some temperature below 0. And what the Arctic ground squirrels do is they produce specific proteins in the lead up to the hibernation season that function as essentially antifreeze molecules.
Wow, okay. That's very interesting. Eddie says the blue quail, and then the scientific name is Excalfactoria adansoni, and the species name comes from the Latin having the property to warm, saying they're also used by the Chinese to warm their hands in cold weather. Their bodies thought to contain a large proportion of animal heat from the pugnacious disposition of their tempers. Any comments, I guess, on the warming properties of blue quails?
I've learned something there as well. I had not heard of that. It's really interesting. Look, the quails are a group that I'd be quite keen to work on, not so much in terms of their use as hand warmers, but in terms of the possibility that they use torpor, because they do belong to one of those really ancient groups of birds, the galliforms. And they're certainly small enough to have the potential to go into torpor. So yeah, I mean that remains to be investigated further. But yeah, I had no idea about the use as hand warmers.
Something to investigate. Then Christo Venter asks about the difference between torpor and hypothermia. Is there a temperature difference? Like, how would you define the two?
Okay, so the third category of heterothermy, so we spoke about hibernation and torpor, but then there's a third category that seems to occur in birds, but not so much in mammals, which involves shallower reductions, so smaller decreases in body temperature. And this kind of goes back to that debate I was mentioning earlier about what actually constitutes torpor and what does not. You certainly see birds dropping their body temperature by a degree or 2. I mean, things like red-headed finches, I looked at them during my PhD, and they drop their body temperature by maximum 2 degrees. You have many species that go down to around 30, just below 30. But again, they seem to be quite responsive, and sometimes even capable of flight. So I would not consider those responses to be genuine torpor. I mean, again, I think, as far as I'm concerned, an argument I've made over the last couple of decades in the literature is that torpor is distinct from these shallower responses because birds are entering that non-responsive state. And that debate's still ongoing. You know what scientists are like. But yeah, I mean, that shallow hypothermia phenomenon is really widespread in birds, possibly ubiquitous in birds. It's a really, really interesting point that he's raised.
Okay. Yeah, to me, your definition kind of makes sense. If they enter this this unresponsive state versus still being
I
able
give
to
you-
fly.
If I give you the email addresses of a couple of colleagues of mine, could you mention that to them, Christina?
I don't know if my opinion will hold much weight, but I can try. I actually have a question, and apologies if I missed it when you were talking, but did you answer the question about why the woodpeckers don't go into torpor?
No, not yet.
Okay.
Not yet. Yeah, it's it's a really puzzling thing. You know, it's something that we need much longer term data for. You know, one of the problems with the equipment we use is that the transmitters have to be so small that the battery life is only a couple of weeks. And so we get these shots into what these birds are doing. You know, and to really convincingly understand if a species ever uses torpor or is even capable of doing so, you need longer term data sets covering a much wider range of conditions than they experience in like a 4-week or 6-week period. So yeah, hopefully I'll have an answer for you in a couple of years' time.
Okay, great. Well, we'll have you back on the show to share those results with us. But I think we will leave it there. It's now almost 8:10. So thank you very much, Andrew, for your fascinating talk. And thank you very much to all our viewers for tuning in. I don't know if you have any last words that you want to share before we close off, Andrew?
No, just to thank everyone for joining. I was quite stunned to see over 300 people at one stage, and I really appreciate the support and the interest in this. So yeah, and Christina, to you guys and the guys at BirdLife, keep up the good work. I think this webinar series is really, really fantastic.
Great, yeah, thank you. And well, we couldn't do it without speakers like you, so thank you very much. And on that note, we will be back again in 2 weeks' time, with another webinar, and this time delivered by 2 of my colleagues and some of their collaborators on the coordinated avifaunal road counts, the car counts. So please do join us in 2 weeks' time. We'll see you then, and good night.